The gun was already pressed against Frederick Collier's chest before Lillian Carter had even finished climbing down from the wagon. "You do not own me," she said, her voice not trembling the way she expected it to, the way every other part of her was trembling. Her fingers were white around the handle of the Colt revolver she had found beneath the wagon seat 3 days ago, and she had spent exactly one of those days learning how to hold it without shaking. Today she was still shaking, but she pressed the barrel harder against the solid wall of his chest anyway, because the shaking was anger, not fear, and there was a difference. "I came out here on a contract, Frederick, not a chain. And that contract ends the moment you lie to my face again." Frederick Collier did not step back. He stood in the amber light of the late September afternoon, the harvest moon not yet risen but the sky already bruising purple and orange at its edges, and he looked down at the gun and then up at her face, and something moved through his expression that was not quite what she expected from a man with a loaded revolver pressed to his heart. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was something quieter and far more dangerous, something that looked almost like relief. "Put the gun down, Lillian. Tell me the truth. Put it down first." "That is not how this works." Her jaw tightened. She had come 300 miles from St. Louis to Redemption Creek, Texas, on the promise of honest work as a schoolteacher on the Collier Ranch. She had left behind a life that had chewed her up and spat her out, a debt she did not owe, a stepfather who had sold her future to the highest bidder, and the ruins of a reputation that had never deserved ruining in the first place. She had come west because west was where things were supposed to be different, and for 11 days they had been. For 11 days, Frederick Collier had been the most unexpectedly decent man she had ever encountered, and then she had found the letter. "The letter from Judge Harlan," she said. "I found it in your desk, Frederick. I was not snooping. I was looking for chalk for the schoolroom because the children had used every piece and I did not want to stop the lesson, and it was sitting right there on top of everything open, like it wanted to be read." Her voice cracked slightly on that last word, and she hated herself for it. "It says you arranged for me to come here. It says you paid for my passage. It says you told the agency I was a widow looking for a fresh start. I am not a widow. I have never been married. You knew everything about me before I ever set foot on this land, and you said nothing." Frederick's eyes, gray and steady as river stones, held hers without flinching. "That is true," he said. The admission hit her like a physical thing. She had expected denial. She had prepared herself for denial. The denial would have been easier to endure because she could have walked away from a lie with her pride intact. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment, and the wind moved through the tall, dry grass around the ranch house, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called out once and was answered by silence. Then Frederick Collier, who was 31 years old and had owned this land for 7 years and had not spoken more than 20 words together to any woman since his mother died, said the truest thing he had ever said out loud. "Because I had heard about you from a man who meant you harm, and I decided you needed somewhere safe before you knew you needed it. And I did it badly. I did it like a man who does not know how to ask for things the right way. And I am sorry for that, Lillian. Truly sorry, but I am not sorry you are here." The gun lowered by approximately 2 inches. She had not decided to lower it. Her body had decided for her. It had started 6 weeks earlier, in the town of Redemption Creek, Texas, in the year 1878. Redemption Creek was not a place that had earned its name. It sat in the scrubby flatlands of West Texas like a scar, a collection of wooden storefronts and sun-bleached saloons pressed up against a creek that ran brown in summer and barely at all come August. There was a general store owned by a man named Holt who cheated on weights. There was a sheriff named Dawes who drank from 11 in the morning and called it medicine. There was a church with no preacher and a school with no teacher, and Frederick Collier had been trying to fix the second problem for the better part of a year. He had not been looking for a wife. He needed to be very clear about that, even to himself, standing in the cramped back office of Judge Harlan's house with a letter from St. Louis spread open on the table between them. He was not a man who thought about such things as wives. He had the ranch. 600 acres of dry grass and cattle, and 3 hands who respected him, and a dog named General who followed him everywhere and slept across the doorway of the house at night. His life was full in the way that useful things are full. There was no room in it that he had identified as empty. And yet, "Her name is Lillian Carter," Judge Harlan had said, pushing the letter across the table with one thick finger. Harlan was 60, red-faced, a man who enjoyed his authority the way other men enjoyed whiskey, which was to say too much and too often. But he had connections in St. Louis, and Redemption Creek needed a schoolteacher, and so Frederick had come to sit across from a man he did not entirely trust because sometimes need overrides preference. 24 years old. Educated at the St. Louis Female Academy, has been working as a governess for the better part of 3 years, but her current situation has become— He paused and tapped the letter. "Untenable. What does that mean?" Frederick had asked. Harlan had looked at him over the rims of his spectacles. "It means that the family she works for has a grown son who has gotten ideas above his station, and Lillian Carter has declined to accommodate those ideas, and the father of that son is now making her life extremely difficult by way of revenge. Her name has been spoken badly in several of the better parlors in St. Louis. Unfairly, from what I understand. But unfairness has never stopped a reputation from being ruined." Frederick had read the letter himself then, carefully, the way he read everything. He was not a fast reader, had learned it late in the quiet of the ranch house at night with a Bible and a dictionary, but he was a thorough one. And as he read, something had settled in his chest, something quiet and certain, the way the land felt before rain when you knew it was coming and you were glad. "Does she know about this letter?" he had asked. "She knows there is a position available in Texas. She knows it comes with housing and a salary. She does not know the specifics of how it was arranged." Frederick had looked up from the letter. "That is going to be a problem," he had said. Harlan had waved a dismissive hand. "Women in her situation do not ask too many questions, Collier. They are grateful for the opportunity." Frederick had not agreed with that assessment, but he had not said so out loud. Instead, he had asked several practical questions about salary and transport and the condition of the schoolroom, and he had paid for Lillian Carter's passage on the stage from St. Louis to Redemption Creek, and he had gone home and stood on his porch in the dark and thought about the fact that he had just done something for a woman he had never met, which was either the most practical thing he had ever done or the most foolish, and he was not entirely certain which. The stage from St. Louis arrived in Redemption Creek on a Tuesday morning in mid-September, 2 days after the air had finally broken and let go of the worst of the summer heat. Frederick was at the Mercantile when it pulled in, not waiting for it, just buying flour and nails with no particular urgency, and he saw Lillian Carter step down from the coach and look at Redemption Creek, the way all sensible people looked at Redemption Creek for the first time, which was with undisguised dismay quickly followed by determined adjustment. She was not what he had built in his mind. He had not built anything in his mind, he told himself firmly, but something in him recognized immediately that whatever undefined shape he had not been imagining, she was a different shape entirely. She was medium height, dark-haired in the way that meant almost black in shadow and warm brown in sunlight, with a face that was too direct to be called pretty in the conventional sense and too interesting to be called anything else. She wore a gray traveling dress that had been good quality once and was now good quality in a tired way, and she carried a single trunk and a leather satchel and a canvas bag that clinked when she moved it, which he would later learn contained 6 books and a set of chalk holders, and an abacus she had bought herself because she had not trusted the one promised in the school's inventory. She looked around Redemption Creek, and then she squared her shoulders, one small precise movement, and she walked toward the office where Judge Harlan was waiting to receive her. Frederick watched her go and then looked back at his flour and nails and thought about rain again. He did not speak to her that first day, or the second. He had arranged for her to stay in the small house at the far end of his property that had previously been used by his foreman before that man had married and moved into town. 2 rooms and a kitchen and a solid roof, and he had made sure it was clean and stocked with supplies before she arrived. He had left a note on the kitchen table written in his careful, deliberate handwriting, listing the practical matters: where to find firewood, where the well was, which days his hands would be working near enough to call on if she needed anything, what time the school bell was expected to ring each morning. He had signed it F. Collier because he was not sure what else to sign it. She had written back the same evening, a note folded and left on the porch post, signed Lillian Carter, formally and completely, because apparently she had found the abbreviated signature amusing and had decided to mock it gently, which told him more about her than an hour of conversation might have. The note said, "Mr. Collier, thank you for the provisions and the information. The house is comfortable and the roof does indeed appear solid. I have examined the schoolroom and found it structurally sound, though it wants a new set of primers and at least one world map, which I will arrange to have sent from San Antonio if you will permit the expense. Also, your dog has been sitting outside my window for the past 2 hours, and I cannot tell if he is guarding me or studying me. Either way, we have reached an understanding. He comes in for half an hour in the evenings and returns to your house at dark. I hope this arrangement suits you." L. Carter, formally and completely. Frederick had read that note 4 times. Then he had called General off her porch and scolded the dog unconvincingly, and General had looked at him with the unconcerned dignity of an animal who knew exactly what he was doing and was not sorry about any of it. By the end of the first week, Lillian Carter had 17 children in her schoolroom, ranging in age from 6 to 14, 3 of whom had never held a pencil. She had established a rule that no one was to feel ashamed of what they did not know, only what they refused to learn, and the parents of Redemption Creek, who had expected a young woman from the city to last approximately 2 weeks before retreating east, found themselves discussing her at the general store with something that was creeping toward respect. Frederick saw her every day in small ways, the way you see someone who shares a piece of your land. She walked past the main corral in the mornings on her way to the schoolroom, and he was usually there checking on the horses at that hour, and they had developed a brief exchange that fit itself naturally into the shape of the morning. She would say something about the weather or the children or something she had read, and he would listen and respond with 2 or 3 sentences, and then they would part ways. It was the most pleasant part of his day. He did not analyze this until his hand, Dahlan, who was 28 and observant in the way that men who work alone are often observant, said one morning while repairing a fence post, "Miss Carter seems like a sensible sort," in the tone of a man who was saying something else entirely. "She is," Frederick said, handing him a nail. Dahlan hammered it in without looking up. "You know she turned down 2 invitations to the saloon dance last Saturday from Danny Pratt." "Danny Pratt is married," Frederick said. "That's what she said." Dahlan tried the post. It held. "Also turned down Henry Walsh, who is not married but is 30 years older than she is and smells of wet wool in all weather." Dahlan: "Just making conversation, boss." Frederick did not respond to that, but he found himself thinking about it later, standing in the kitchen heating water for coffee, General asleep on the floor, the evening outside the window going from gold to purple. He thought about the fact that Lillian Carter had been in Redemption Creek for 10 days, and had already attracted the attention of men who were wrong for her in ways that were obvious to everyone except themselves, and something in him, the same quiet certain thing that had felt like approaching rain when he read her file, wanted very much to put itself between her and that particular brand of attention. This was inconvenient. This was, in fact, precisely the kind of inconvenience he had spent 31 years successfully avoiding. He decided to ignore it. He was not successful. On the 11th day, he found the chalk. More precisely, Lillian found him while he was mending the schoolroom window latch, which had been loose since before she arrived, and she asked if he had an extra piece of chalk, because the children had used the last of hers on a particularly ambitious mathematics problem that had taken up half the blackboard, and he had said he thought there was some in the desk, and she had gone to look in the desk, and she had found the letter from Judge Harlan instead. And now she stood with a gun pressed against his chest in the amber light of late September, and the harvest moon was beginning to edge its orange rim above the eastern horizon, and Frederick Collier realized that he had about 60 seconds to either lose her entirely or be honest in a way he had never been honest with anyone, and the second option was terrifying and the first option was worse. "Sit down," he said, gently, "the way you speak to something you do not want to startle. Please. Let me explain everything from the beginning, and if you want to leave after that, I will drive you to the stage myself." Lillian Carter kept the gun raised for 3 more seconds, and then she lowered it and put it in the pocket of her apron, and she sat down on the porch step of the ranch house with the kind of deliberate composure that told him she was barely holding herself together and was too proud to let it show, which meant she had been badly hurt before, badly enough to build this kind of control into her bones. He sat down on the step beside her, leaving a proper distance between them, and he told her everything. He told her about Judge Harlan's letter. He told her about the man named Rourke in St. Louis, Jeffrey Rourke, the son of a prominent dry goods merchant, who had decided that a pretty governess declining his advances was a personal insult that deserved systematic destruction, and who had been working through the better parlors of St. Louis with a particular kind of polite cruelty, the kind that leaves no fingerprints. He told her that Harlan had contacts in St. Louis who had forwarded the information, that Frederick himself had no connection to Rourke or St. Louis or any of it, except the accident of needing a schoolteacher at the same moment she needed an exit. He told her that he had paid for her passage because someone needed to, and because the alternative was leaving her in a city that was being slowly turned against her by a man who had no right and no reason except wounded vanity. He told her that he had not told her any of this because Harlan had advised against it, and because Frederick himself had not known how, and because he had been afraid that knowing the full circumstances of how she had come here would make her feel like a charity case, which she was absolutely not. He told her that the position of schoolteacher was real, the salary was real, the children needed her, and not a single one of those things was a deception. Then he stopped talking and let the silence be what it needed to be. Lillian Carter sat very still beside him for a long time. The harvest moon was rising in earnest now, enormous and orange, painting everything on the flat Texas land with a light that made the world look like copper and old amber. General had crept up from somewhere and was lying across both their feet with the supreme confidence of an animal that was not going to be asked to move. "Jeffrey Rourke told his father I had stolen from the household," Lillian said finally. Her voice was very quiet. "That is how they chose to do it, not an assault claim because his father would have had to examine that too closely. Theft. It cannot be disproved because you cannot prove the absence of a thing, and once a woman in my position is called a thief, she is finished in that city." "Yes," Frederick said, "I know." She turned and looked at him, then really looked at him, the way she had not done directly before, and he bore it the way he bore most things, steadily and without flinching because he had nothing to hide from her now. "Why do you care?" she asked. "You did not know me. You had a file and a problem to solve. You needed a teacher. There are other women who could have come." Frederick thought about that carefully before he answered, because it deserved a careful answer. "I read that file," he said. "I read what Rourke did, and I read what you were before he did it, and it seemed to me that those two things did not match. A woman who taught herself advanced arithmetic from library books, and who wrote letters to the mayor of St. Louis about the absence of a public lending library, and who stayed in a position for 3 years protecting children she did not own from a man who could not be touched, did not deserve to be finished. She deserved a different start." He paused. "And I knew I could provide one, so I did." Lillian looked at him for a moment longer, and then she turned back to the rising moon, and her hands were clasped in her lap, very tight. "I am not a stray that needed collecting," she said. "No," he agreed. "You are not. I never thought that. I thought you were someone who had been dealt an injustice and who deserved better odds. That is different." Another long silence. An owl called from somewhere in the oak trees behind the house. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes," he said. "I should have. I was wrong not to. I am sorry." She was quiet again, but something had shifted in the quality of the silence. Something small and significant. The way water changes when it stops running fast and finds level ground. "The children used my last piece of chalk on a long division problem," she said, and her voice now had a different texture in it, not warmth exactly, not yet, but the edge of it, the possibility of it. The problem was 1247 divided by 31. They were arguing about the remainder. Frederick considered this. "4," he said. "The remainder is 4. She turned and looked at him again. "You did that in your head." "I have been doing accounts for this ranch for 7 years," he said. "Numbers are not unfamiliar to me." The corner of her mouth moved. It was not a smile. It was the territory adjacent to a smile, the area just before it, and he was aware of it the way you are aware of the first warmth before a fire catches. "Well," she said, and stood up and brushed her skirt with both hands, "I suppose that is something." General grumbled at being displaced and relocated his warmth to Frederick's boots alone. "I will stay," she said. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the harvest moon, which was clear and enormous and had risen high enough now to turn from orange to pale gold. "Not because of your reasons, because of mine. Because this land and those children need something real, and I am real, and I would like very much for something I do to mean something permanent." She paused. "But we are going to be honest with each other from now on, completely." "Completely," he agreed. She walked back to her small house at the far end of the property, and Frederick sat on the porch with General until the moon was fully up and white, and he thought about the fact that before the harvest moon had risen, he had already known she was staying, had known it with that same quiet certainty, that bone-deep sense of rightness, the approaching rain. He had known it before she picked up the gun, before she confronted him, before she demonstrated the particular brand of courage that lived in her like a pilot light, small and continuous and very hard to extinguish. He just had not known she would be the one to decide it. That distinction mattered to him. It mattered enormously. The weeks that followed were different, changed in the way that honest things are different from the things that precede them. There was no more distance manufactured to avoid the question of what he was feeling, because she had asked it directly, and he had answered it directly, and they had both stepped into the altered territory together. It was not a simple territory. Lillian Carter was not a simple woman, a fact he appreciated with increasing depth as October settled over the Texas flatlands, and the mornings came in cold and bright, and the cattle needed moving to the south pasture before the first hard frost. She was precise about things that mattered and unexpectedly flexible about things that did not. A combination he found refreshing in the way clean water is refreshing when you have been drinking from uncertain sources. She disagreed with him when she disagreed with him, clearly and without apology, but she always explained her reasoning, and her reasoning was almost always worth examining. She disagreed with him, for instance, about the matter of Tomás Vega. Tomás was 11 years old, the son of a Mexican family that had been farming a small piece of leased land on the south edge of Frederick's property for 4 years. He was one of Lillian's students, and he was, by every observable measure, the most naturally gifted student she had ever taught, quick with numbers and with language, and with the kind of spatial reasoning that allowed him to look at a problem from 4 angles simultaneously. He was also, by every observable social measure of Redemption Creek, Texas, in 1878, not expected to continue his education past the age of 12. "I want to write to the normal school in San Antonio," Lillian told Frederick on an October evening when he had come to her small house to discuss the cattle count, which was the pretense they had evolved for spending time in each other's company in a way that satisfied the watching eyes of Redemption Creek. I want to ask about scholarship provisions. There are programs for exceptional students. Tamaz is exceptional. His father will not permit it, Frederick said. His father has not been asked in the right way. The men in this town will not accept it. The men in this town are not his teachers. She looked at him steadily over the kitchen table. Are you telling me not to try? I am telling you it is complicated, he said. Everything worth doing is complicated. She lifted her chin slightly. I am asking if you will support it or not. He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything. Then he said, I will speak to Alejandro Vega myself. I will frame it as a matter of the boy's practical value to the region. It is true, and it is a language the men here understand. Lillian looked at him for a moment with that particular directness that he had come to understand. Meant she was measuring the distance between what he had said and what she had hoped he would say. And then she nodded once. That is something, she said, which was becoming between them, a form of qualified approval. He did speak to Alejandro Vega, and he framed it in practical terms, and it took 3 conversations over 2 weeks. But by the end of October, there was a letter on its way to San Antonio asking about scholarship opportunities for a boy named Tamaz Vega of Redemption Creek, Texas. He told Lillian about it on a Tuesday morning at the corral, their usual brief intersection of days, and she looked at him with something that was not the territory adjacent to a smile but the smile itself, full and direct and warm, and it lasted only a moment before she composed herself and said, "Good," and walked on toward the schoolroom. Frederick stood at the corral fence for a full 2 minutes after she had gone, watching the direction she had walked, and then Dallin appeared at his elbow and said, with great studied innocence, "Frost coming tonight, probably," and Frederick told him to go fix the water trough. October deepened. The days grew short and the evenings long, and Redemption Creek in the autumn was almost beautiful in the way that plain things can be beautiful when the light does them a favor. The gold grass and the pale sky, and the distant blue line of the hills to the west. Lillian had begun to know the land by walking it on Sunday afternoons when the school was closed, and Frederick had begun, almost without deciding to accompany her on those walks. They talked on those walks in a way they did not talk in the mornings at the corral, which were brief and functional. Sunday afternoons had no function except themselves, and without function to organize the conversation, it spread and found its own level, touching things that mattered. She told him about her childhood in a house in Ohio where her mother had been gentle, and her father had died young and her stepfather had arrived when she was 10 with his own particular brand of coldness, not cruel in any demonstrable way, just absent from her in all the ways that mattered, treating her as a liability to be managed. She had educated herself as a form of resistance. She explained, books and study as a declaration that she was more than what she had been assigned to be. He told her about coming to Texas at 23 with $112, and the particular kind of stubbornness that is indistinguishable from faith. Buying the first piece of this land from a man who thought he was cheating him and discovering, in the dry grass and flat sky, something that fit him the way nothing in Ohio ever had. He had worked the ranch alone for 2 years before he could afford help. He had made every mistake available to a young man in possession of land and no experience, and the land had been patient with him while he learned. "You love this land," she said one afternoon, and it was not a question. "Yes," he said simply. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the western hills. "I think I am beginning to understand why," she said, and there was something in her voice that was both careful and genuine, as if she was handing him something real and wanted to make sure it was received correctly. He received it correctly. He received it as the significant thing it was, which was a woman who had been uprooted deciding to put down a root, tentative and testing the soil, but real. "The land has a way of doing that," he said, "to the right people." She looked at him then, and whatever might have been said next was interrupted by the appearance of young Willie Holt, 12 years old and one of her students, running across the south field toward them with the particular urgency of a child delivering terrible news, his hat in his hand. "Miss Carter, Miss Carter, there is a man at Judge Harlan's office and he has papers and he is asking about you," and the judge looks scared, "and that means everyone else should be scared too, is what my father always says." The man at Judge Harlan's office was named Bernard Rourke. He was Jeffrey's older brother, and he was 40 years old and carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone who had the power to make it stick. He was in Redemption Creek on what he described as personal business, and the papers he carried were from a St. Louis magistrate, and they concerned the matter of a theft complaint that had been filed against one Lillian Carter, formerly employed in the household of Preston Rourke. Frederick learned all of this within 20 minutes of reaching the judge's office, because he walked into that office with Lillian beside him and remained there without being invited, and nobody told him to leave, because nobody in Redemption Creek told Frederick Collier to leave anywhere he decided to go, not because he was intimidating in any obvious way, but because he had a quality of settled certainty that made the idea of moving him feel about as practical as moving a hill. Bernard Rourke looked at Frederick with cool assessment and said, "This does not concern you, Mr. Collier." "Miss Carter works for me," Frederick said. "It concerns me." "The charge is theft," Rourke said, addressing the room generally. "A set of silver-handled brushes were found to be missing from my brother's household upon Miss Carter's departure. The magistrate has granted a warrant." "A warrant from Missouri," Frederick said, "in Texas, through a county judge who has no obligation to honor it." Rourke smiled the kind of smile that means "I expected this. I am prepared to take this to the federal level if necessary, Mr. Collier. My family has connections." "As does mine," Frederick said, which was nearly true if you counted Judge Harlan himself, who owed Frederick for the matter of the disputed water rights 2 years ago, and who was currently sitting behind his desk looking as if he wished very much to be somewhere else. Lillian, who had been silent through this exchange with the rigid composure of someone clenching a very tight fist on the inside, said, "I did not take anything from your brother's household, Mr. Rourke. I left with what I came with, which was not much, and I left because your brother made it impossible for me to remain." Rourke's expression did not change. "My brother tells a different story." "Your brother is a liar," Lillian said, clearly and without inflection. The room was very quiet. Bernard Rourke set his papers down on the judge's desk very carefully. "I am going to need to speak with you privately, Miss Carter," he said. "No," Frederick said. "I beg your pardon. I said no." Frederick picked up the papers from the judge's desk, examined them, set them back down. These were filed in Missouri on September the 2nd. Lillian Carter arrived in Redemption Creek on September the 15th. The complaint predates the supposed discovery of the missing items by 3 days, according to this document. "Mr. Rourke, your brother filed a theft complaint before he claimed the theft had occurred." The silence changed quality. Judge Harlan put his spectacles on and leaned forward and looked at the papers. Bernard Rourke's jaw tightened by approximately 2 degrees. "That is a clerical error," Rourke said. "It is the kind of clerical error," Frederick said quietly, "that makes documents inadmissible." Lillian was looking at him. He was aware of it the way you are aware of warmth on the side of your face, a peripheral brightness, but he kept his eyes on Rourke because this was not finished. "Let me be plain with you," Frederick said. "You have ridden 300 miles to deliver a document that contains its own refutation. You can leave Redemption Creek tonight and we say no more about it, or you can pursue this, and I will write to the St. Louis Courier, whose editor owes me a personal favor, about the practices of your family's household regarding female employees. I understand the details would be of significant public interest." He did not actually know the editor of the St. Louis Courier, but he knew Judge Harlan knew a man who did, and he was banking on Bernard Rourke not knowing the difference. Bernard Rourke looked at him for a long moment, measuring, the way men measure men, for weight and seriousness. Then he gathered his papers from the desk and he said, "Good evening," to the room, and he left. Harlan let out a breath that suggested he had been holding it since the man arrived. Lillian said nothing for a long moment. Then she said quietly to Frederick, "Did you mean that, about the newspaper?" "More or less," he said. "More or less," she repeated, and the corner of her mouth moved in that particular way again, warm and near to something, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the wall. "Thank you," she said, with some difficulty, the way people say thank you when the gratitude is too large for the words, and they know it but have nothing bigger available. "You are welcome," he said. They rode back to the ranch in the early evening, the light going gold and long across the grass, and Frederick drove the wagon and Lillian sat beside him on the seat with her hands folded in her lap, and for once they did not talk much. They did not need to. Something had settled between them, not softness exactly, but solidity, the kind of thing that builds between people who have stood together against something and come through it with their integrity intact. General, who had somehow gotten himself into the back of the wagon, put his head on Lillian's shoulder from behind, and she lifted her hand and scratched his ears without looking at him, which told Frederick everything he needed to know about how she was feeling. November came to Redemption Creek with cold nights and the smell of wood smoke from every chimney, and the world contracted in the way it does in winter, drawing closer to fire and shelter and the specific warmth of proximity. The small house at the far end of the property was comfortable. Lillian had made it so with the focused practicality she brought to everything. A rag rug she had braided herself on the kitchen floor, curtains made from cloth purchased at Holt's Mercantile, a row of books on a plank shelf above the fireplace that had grown from 6 to 14 over 2 months of careful acquisition. Frederick brought her firewood every 3 days without being asked, and she accepted it without making it into anything more or less than what it was, which was care offered plainly and received plainly. She brought him meals sometimes, appearing at his door with a pot of something on the excuse that she had cooked too much, and he accepted those with the same plainness, sitting across the kitchen table from her while he ate, talking about the ranch or the school or the book she was reading, and the domesticity of it settled around them both as naturally as if it had been arranged by someone who understood exactly what they needed. "You have never been easy with people," she observed one evening, not unkindly, watching him cut the bread she had brought with more precision than bread cutting required. "No," he agreed. "Why not?" He considered the question. "I'm not sure things are ever easy with people," he said. "There are people who manage the difficulty by not caring much about the outcome. I care about the outcome. That makes it harder." She looked at him across the table. "I am the same way," she said. "Exactly the same way." He set the bread knife down and looked at her, and neither of them said anything more about it, but they both felt the recognition of it, the particular relief of being understood in a way you had given up expecting. It was Dahlan who precipitated the next crisis, which was not Dahlan's fault, as the crisis had been building entirely independently of anything he did. Dahlan mentioned, casually, one cold morning in early November, that a man had been seen near the east fence line twice in the past week, a stranger, well-dressed for someone on horseback in the middle of nowhere, who had not introduced himself and who had ridden away when spotted. Frederick did not immediately connect this to Lillian. He had land disputes of his own with a neighboring rancher named Cass Bridwell, who had been trying to move the surveyed boundary of the eastern parcel 200 yards west for 3 years through a combination of legal harassment and physical posturing. He assumed the man was Bridwell's lawyer or one of his hands. He was wrong. The man's name was Jeffrey Rourke, not Bernard, Jeffrey himself. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon, riding up the main track to the ranch house with the particular arrogance of a man who had never been made to feel unwelcome anywhere, and had decided that Texas was not going to change this. He was 28, dressed too well, with a face that had been handsome before whatever he was had finished settling into it, leaving behind something that looked like pleasantness and was not. Frederick was at the main house when Rourke rode up. He watched him come from the porch and did not go out to meet him, which was a form of statement, and Rourke had to dismount and approach the porch step, which meant he was below Frederick, which was a second form of statement. "Mr. Collier," Rourke said, as if they had met before. "You are on my land without invitation," Frederick said. Rourke smiled. "I have come to speak with Lillian. I think she and I have some things to discuss. I believe she may have left St. Louis under some misunderstandings that I am here to clear up. There is nothing you have to say to Miss Carter that she has any interest in hearing," Frederick said. "Particularly given the timing of the theft complaint your family filed." Rourke's smile did not change. "There is no theft complaint," he said. "My brother handled that badly. It was a misunderstanding. I have come to resolve it." "It is resolved," Frederick said. "She is here and she is staying. There is nothing to resolve." Rourke looked up at him for a moment, assessing, and then he said, "Lillian and I have a history, Mr. Collier. I do not think you fully understand the nature of it." "I understand it completely," Frederick said, and his voice had gone to that flat, quiet place that was not anger but was what sits on the other side of anger when a man has decided what he is and is not prepared to accept. "I understand that you made advances she declined, and that you responded to that refusal with a systematic effort to destroy her livelihood and her reputation, and I understand that she is now 300 miles from you, and that is exactly where she belongs and where she is going to remain." Rourke's expression had changed. The pleasantness was gone, and what was underneath it was neither pleasant nor handsome. "You cannot keep a woman here against her will," he said. "No one is keeping her against her will," Frederick said. "I am asking you to leave my property against yours." Lillian's voice came from behind him. She had come from the direction of the schoolroom, had seen the horse at the post, and had understood before she reached the house. "Geoffrey," she said. Her voice was steady and clear as a bell and cold as November. Rourke turned to face her. Whatever script he had prepared died in his throat when he saw her face. Because Lillian Carter at this moment was not the frightened governess he had last seen in St. Louis, was not the woman whose livelihood he had threatened into flight. She had been in Texas for 2 months, and those 2 months had changed the axis of her bearing in some fundamental way, standing straight in the cold afternoon light on the step of a ranch that was not hers and yet somehow was, with 300 miles of flat Texas land at her back and the weight of all of it behind her. "I have nothing to discuss with you," she said. "I am asking you to leave." Rourke said, his voice lowering into something that was meant to be intimate. "Lillian, you have been deceived. This man arranged your coming here. He is not what he appears. I know exactly how I came to be here," she said. "Mr. Collier told me, all of it, 3 weeks ago." She let that settle. "You no longer have the advantage of the secret, Geoffrey. I know everything. And I chose to stay." Geoffrey Rourke stood in the yard between them, and the narrative he had built in his mind on 300 miles of riding, the heroic rescue, the grateful return, the restoration of his wounded dignity, collapsed around him in the Texas afternoon. He was a man accustomed to controlling stories, and this one had already been written without him. He looked at Frederick and then at Lillian, and whatever he saw in both their faces told him what there was to know. And then he mounted his horse and rode back down the track and out through the gate, and Frederick watched until the dust had settled. Lillian stood beside him on the porch step, closer than their usual careful distance allowed. He could feel the slight vibration in her, not fear. He knew now, never fear exactly, but the particular controlled trembling of fury held down by will. "He is not coming back," Frederick said. "How do you know?" she asked. "Because he is not the kind of man who does anything twice when it has failed him this badly," he said. "He has too much pride for it. Wounded pride and determination are different things." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I should have faced him before this. In St. Louis, I ran instead." "You were 24 years old and alone, and he had all the institutional weight of his family behind him," Frederick said. "That is not running. That is reading the odds and making a practical choice." She looked at him. "You are very good at making difficult things sound logical," she said, but her voice had warmth in it, real warmth, not the carefully managed adjacent to warmth of the previous weeks. "Someone has to be," he said. She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh fully, not the controlled near-smile of their previous months but an actual laugh, surprised out of her, brief and genuine, and it changed her face entirely, broke the precise composure into something open and real, and he felt it land in his chest like the first note of something he had been waiting a long time to hear. After that, the careful distance between them had an acknowledged quality to it, as if they had both agreed to maintain something that they both understood was a temporary arrangement, scaffolding waiting to be taken down when the structure beneath it was ready to stand alone. It took another 3 weeks. Those 3 weeks were the best 3 weeks Frederick Collier had ever spent on Earth, which he was dimly aware was either extremely telling or extremely embarrassing or possibly both. She was helping him with the winter accounts one evening in late November, which she had offered to do because the ranch kept its own school records, and she had noticed his ledger system was inefficient, and he had accepted because it gave him a reason to invite her to the main house in the evenings, where they sat at the kitchen table with the accounts spread between them, and the fire going and general dozing under the table like a large domestic rug. She had reorganized 3 years of ledgers in 2 evenings, and had found a billing error with the cattle market in San Antonio that represented $47 in his favor, which she had presented to him with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who finds pleasure in setting things in order. "You could have been an accountant," he said, meaning it as a compliment. "I could have been many things," she said, without bitterness, which meant she had made peace with the distance between possibility and path, at least enough to speak about it plainly. "The academy trained us for teaching and governess work and marriage, in that order of institutional interest." She closed the ledger with a soft sound. "I always preferred the first. I was better at it." "You are exceptional at it," he said. He was not prone to superlatives, and she heard the weight of it. She looked at him across the kitchen table, the lamplight warm between them, and said, "Why have you never married, Frederick?" It was the first time she had used his first name without the formal Mr. preceding it. He registered this the way a compass registers north, a small definitive movement toward orientation. "I have never met anyone I wanted to marry," he said. "And now?" she asked very quietly. He looked at her for a long time. This woman who had held a gun to his chest and made him tell the truth and chose to stay on her own terms, and faced down a man who had spent months trying to destroy her, and reorganized his accounts and laughed in his yard, and sat in his kitchen in the November dark. This woman who was specifically and exactly Lillian Carter in all the ways that made her nobody else in the world. "I am trying to be patient," he said, which was the most honest thing he could offer, and she understood it exactly, because she was sitting across from him thinking something nearly identical. "You are doing well," she said, and they both smiled, and General opened one eye from under the table and surveyed the situation and went back to sleep. He asked her properly on the first day of December, which was a cold, clear Thursday with frost on the grass and the smell of winter in the air, and he did it on the Sunday walk she had mentioned wanting to take before the weather made them impractical. He had thought carefully about how to do it and had concluded that with Lillian, directness was the only architecture that worked. "I want to ask you something," he said, as they walked along the South Creek bed, dried to a thin stream in November. "Then ask it," she said. "I would like to court you," he said, formally, with the intention of marriage if you are willing. "Not as a condition of your position here. Your position stands regardless, and not because it is expected or because of whatever Redemption Creek thinks of the arrangement. Because I want to. Because I think you are the most remarkable person I have ever met, and because the days you are in them are better than the days you are not, and because I would like, if you are willing, to make that permanent." Lillian Carter walked 3 more paces before she answered, looking straight ahead, and he walked beside her in the cold December air waiting. "Yes," she said, then, "with conditions." "Name them," he said immediately. She looked at him now, her expression serious and warm at once. I keep the school. That is the first condition, and it is non-negotiable. I am not leaving those children." "Agreed without reservation," he said. "The second condition is that we make decisions together, about the ranch, about the future, about everything significant. I will not be a decoration or an afterthought." "I would not want you to be," he said, and he meant it in the complete way that serious people mean things. "Third condition," she said, and now the corner of her mouth was doing the thing, the not-quite smile that preceded the real one. "You tell General he reports to both of us now. He has been playing both sides of this arrangement for months, and it needs to be made official." Frederick laughed, which surprised them both, a real laugh, and she turned fully toward him and smiled, the full, complete smile, and he stopped walking because he needed a moment to stand still with the fact of her looking at him like that. He reached out and took her hand carefully, with the deliberateness of a man who is making a decision he has been building toward for months, and she let him take it, and he held it, and they stood on the frozen grass by the South Creek in the December cold, and that was how it began, plainly and certainly and entirely on their own terms. They were married in February of 1879, in the Church of Redemption Creek, with no preacher but with Judge Harlan officiating, because Texas law permitted it, and with the entirety of the town in attendance, including the 17 children of the schoolroom, who had been told only that there was a celebration, and had arrived with muddy boots and enormous enthusiasm. Lillian wore a dress of dark blue wool that she had sent for from San Antonio, and Frederick wore his good suit that had last been worn at his mother's funeral 8 years ago and still fit, because he was not a man who changed shape easily, and Dolan stood beside him and kept managing not to cry with mixed success, and General, who had been specifically excluded from the church, sat outside the window and could be seen periodically through the glass with the air of a dog attending an important outdoor performance. The ceremony was brief and without excessive ceremony, which suited them both. When Harlan asked Frederick if he took this woman, he said, "I do," in the same tone in which he made all serious commitments, which was quiet and absolute and left no room for misunderstanding. When he asked Lillian, she said, "I do," in her own voice, clear and direct, and then she looked at Frederick, and something passed between them that the assembled population of Redemption Creek would describe afterward in various ways depending on their temperament and their proximity, but which was, at its core, simply recognition, two people confirming something they had already known. The spring following the wedding was the best spring Frederick had known in 7 years on the land. Not because of the weather, though the weather was good, the first good spring after 3 years of insufficient rain, the grass coming in green and the creek running properly, and the cattle gaining weight in the south pasture the way cattle should. It was the best spring because of the specific quality that mornings had now, the particular way the ranch house felt at 6 o'clock with the fire going and Lillian at the kitchen table with her coffee, and the lesson plans she was already adjusting for the coming week, and the way she looked up when he came in from the early check on the horses, and the way the ordinary morning arranged itself around both of them as if it had always been intended to. They had their disagreements, because they were both people with strong convictions about things that mattered, and because the ranch and the school and the management of a life together in the West in 1879 produced regular questions that had more than one reasonable answer. They argued about the expansion of the south pasture fence, which Frederick wanted to do in a way Lillian thought would damage the creek bed and thereby the water supply, and she was right, and he adjusted the plan. They argued about the reading level of the primers she had ordered for the school, which Frederick thought were too advanced, and Lillian thought were exactly right, and she was right about that too, and Frederick told her so. They argued about whether to invite Judge Harlan to Sunday dinner, which Lillian had deep reservations about given the man's role in the original arrangement, and Frederick acknowledged the legitimacy of the reservation and let her set the terms of any future engagement with Harlan, which she did. requiring an apology she never actually received, but whose absence she handled with the dignified practicality of a woman who has decided that some battles are complete whether the other party surrenders or not. The letter from San Antonio came in April, addressed to Tomás Vega, and it contained news of a scholarship to the normal school for the following year, conditional on an entrance examination the boy would need to sit in June. Lillian brought the letter to Frederick before she brought it to Alejandro Vega, not because she needed his permission, but because she wanted to share the moment with him, and he understood the distinction and was glad. They went together to the Vega farm on a Sunday afternoon in April with the spring light long and warm on the new grass, and they sat at Alejandro's kitchen table and Lillian translated the letter into Spanish, while Frederick sat quietly and watched the man across the table absorb the fact that his son had a future that was larger than the one he had imagined, and watched the various emotions move through Alejandro's face. Pride and fear, and the particular grief of a parent, recognizing that a child's horizon extends beyond what the parent can see. And when Alejandro finally spoke, what he said was a question about whether Tomás would be safe, all those miles away, a Mexican boy in an institution full of Anglo children, and it was Frederick who answered, looking Alejandro Vega in the eyes, saying that he knew the superintendent of the school in San Antonio personally, which was almost true, and that he would write a letter ensuring that any incident was reported directly to him, and that he would ensure the boy's protection as if he were his own. And he meant that completely, in the way he meant the things that mattered. Alejandro Vega shook his hand for a long time, and then Lillian and Maria Vega embraced in the doorway, and Tomás, who had been called in from the field and told the news and was currently vibrating with something too large to contain, looked at Frederick with an 11-year-old's earnest gratitude and said, "Thank you, Mr. Collier," and Frederick said, "Thank your teacher," and looked at Lillian, who was looking at him over Maria Vega's shoulder with that full, open smile. The one that had stopped him in his tracks on the frozen grass in December, and he thought, not for the first time, that he would do approximately anything to see that smile regularly for the rest of his life. The summer of 1879 was hot and dry, as Texas summers are, and the work on the ranch intensified with the heat, the cattle drives and the water management, and the fencing and the ordinary large labor of keeping land and animals alive in a climate that was perpetually indifferent. Frederick worked from before dawn until dark, and Lillian kept the school through June and then spent July organizing the community lending library she had been proposing since October, a collection of books housed in the back room of the church, managed on a rotating loan basis, open to anyone in Redemption Creek regardless of circumstance. Holt at the Mercantile had declined to contribute. Dahlin had donated his personal copy of Robert Louis Stevenson, which he then borrowed back immediately. 3 families from the Mexican settlement at the south edge of town had donated books in Spanish, which Lillian cataloged with the same care as the English volumes and placed on the same shelves, which was itself a statement. Frederick donated $27 to purchase the books she had not been able to collect through donation, quietly, without making it into a ceremony, and when she found out about it, which she did because he told her directly, not wanting any more hidden arrangements between them, she stood in the kitchen and looked at him for a moment and then walked across the room and put her hand on his face, just her palm against his jaw, for one quiet moment. And he turned his face slightly and pressed a brief kiss to her palm, and that was all. In August she told him she was pregnant. He was sitting at the kitchen table with the accounts when she said it, and he went entirely still for a moment, the pen suspended over the ledger, and then he set the pen down and stood up and crossed to where she was standing by the window and held her, carefully, deliberately, both arms around her in the solid, reliable way he held everything he valued, and he did not say anything for a long time because there was nothing to say that would be adequate. And he had never had any use for words that were inadequate. "Are you frightened?" he asked finally, "A little," she said honestly, because she was never dishonest about important things. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, "but I am glad." "So am I," she said. He held her in the kitchen while the evening went dark outside and General scratched at the door to be let in, and the ranch was quiet around them. This 100 acres of dry grass and solid fences and growing things, and the life they had built between them out of honesty and stubbornness, and increasingly, a love so solid and particular that it had its own weight. Their son was born in April of 1880, a week later than expected, healthy and loud, with the remarkable dark hair of his mother and the gray eyes of his father, which combination Dahlin declared entirely unfair to the rest of humanity. They named him James, after Lillian's father, the one who had died young and left before she could know him properly. Frederick had suggested it after she mentioned her father's name once on a Sunday walk, carefully, the way she mentioned things she was uncertain were safe to say. And when he suggested it, she had looked at him with the expression she reserved for moments when he understood her more completely than she had expected, which was happening with increasing frequency. James Collier was a healthy and opinionated child from the beginning, inheriting the best and most inconvenient qualities of both his parents. He slept with General until General, who was by now somewhat elderly and had developed strong opinions about sleep, declined the arrangement, at which point James transferred his nighttime affections to a stuffed horse that Lillian had made from scraps of a worn-out saddle blanket, which he named Frederick, a choice that caused the original Frederick to respond with a dignity that took genuine effort. Lillian returned to the schoolroom 6 weeks after James was born, bringing him with her in the first weeks, and then establishing a rotation of assistants from Maria Vega and 2 other women in town who were glad of the occupation. Redemption Creek had gotten used to the idea that the school was permanent, and that Miss Carter, now Mrs. Collier, was not going anywhere, and the town had organized itself accordingly, with the school now receiving a small annual allocation from the county, which Lillian had negotiated with the county commissioner, by writing him a letter that was so precisely and factually devastating to the arguments against allocation that he had apparently read it twice, and then funded the school without further discussion. Frederick told her she should have been a lawyer. She told him she had considered it, but the bar was not yet open to women in Texas. He said that was the bar's loss. She said yes, it was, with the serene confidence of a woman who had stopped apologizing for what she was capable of. Tomás Vega sat his entrance examination in June of 1880 and passed with the highest marks of any candidate that year, which the San Antonio Daily Express noted in a small item that Frederick cut out and sent to Alejandro Vega without comment. Tomás began at the normal school in September, came home for Christmas with the specific energy of a young person discovering that the world is larger and more accessible than they had been led to believe, sat at Lillian's kitchen table for 3 hours telling her about his first semester, and left on the stage back to San Antonio with a box of her dried apples and a list of books she had personally annotated for him. Frederick watched him go from the porch and thought about the chain of small, consequential decisions that had brought Tomás Vega to a stage to San Antonio instead of a field at the south edge of a leased ranch, and the woman who had been the center of all of them, standing at the top of that chain with her back straight and her clear dark eyes, and the absolute refusal to accept that the world had to be smaller than it should be. He loved her in the way that men who take things seriously love things, which is completely and without much outward demonstration, and with a bone-deep certainty that did not require daily announcement. But he also loved her in the particular ways of that specific woman, with the morning coffee she always made too strong, and the way she talked to General as if he were a participant in the conversation, and the way she still squared her shoulders, that one small precise movement when she was preparing for something difficult, and the way she laughed, still surprised and genuine, never performed. He loved her in the way she argued with him, clearly and thoroughly and without resentment, and the way she listened, genuinely listened when he spoke, with the focused attention of a woman who understands that listening is its own form of respect. He did not always say these things, but he showed them in the steady, reliable ways available to him, in the daily structure of a life built specifically around and with her, in the decisions made together, in the land that was both of theirs now in the way that is deeper than legal, in the small house at the end of the property that stood empty now, and was used for storage and occasionally as a quiet reading room when James was energetic and Lillian needed an hour of peace, which she found and which she deserved. Their second child came in the spring of 1882, a daughter this time named Clara after no one specific, just because the name fit her, which it did from the first. A composed and watchful child who surveyed the world from her earliest weeks with an expression that suggested she was cataloging information and reserving judgment, which was thoroughly her mother. Clara and James were close in the way that children spaced 2 years apart can be, which includes intervals of complete alliance and intervals of completely opposite goals, and Frederick managed the conflicts between them with the same calm he brought to everything, and Lillian managed them with more vehemence and eventual effectiveness, and General, ancient and dignified, managed them by refusing to be drawn into any of it. General died in the spring of 1883, peacefully in the kitchen, across the doorway where he had slept for 10 years. Frederick found him in the early morning and sat with him for a while before he told anyone, and when he came inside, Lillian looked at his face and knew, and she did not say anything, but she put her hand on his arm for a long moment. And that was right. That was exactly the shape of comfort he needed from her, not words but presence, which was also exactly the shape of love between two people who have learned each other fully. They buried General under the oak tree behind the house, and James, at age 3, placed a stick he had carried from the creek on the grave with great ceremonial gravity, which made both his parents look carefully in opposite directions for a moment. A new dog arrived the following spring, self-appointed, a rangy red creature of uncertain heritage who appeared at the corral fence one morning and declined to leave, and was eventually named General II by James, shortened to Second by everyone else, who displayed all the territorial confidence of his predecessor, and within 3 months was asleep across the kitchen doorway as if he had been arranged there by the cosmos. The school grew. By 1884, Redemption Creek had 30 children of school age, and Lillian had applied to the county for a second teacher, a process that involved 3 letters and 1 meeting with the commissioner in which she was politely told it was unlikely, and then told her husband about it that evening with the expression she wore when she had already decided the conversation was not over. The second teacher arrived in September of that year, a young man named Peter Walsh from Austin who was 22 and enthusiastic and slightly afraid of Lillian in the healthy way of people who respect precision, and the school became what it was always going to become, which was permanent and real and important. Frederick expanded the ranch in 1884 as well, purchasing the eastern parcel from Cass Bridwell, who had finally run out of legal arguments and financial patience, which meant Bridwell's long campaign to move the survey boundary was permanently resolved, which meant 600 acres became 900, which meant more cattle and more work, and a conversation with Lillian about hiring a 4th hand that went the way their important conversations always went, which was that they sat at the kitchen table and looked at the numbers together and discussed the practical and financial dimensions, and arrived at a conclusion they both understood and supported. The 4th hand was a young man from San Antonio named Ramon Cruz, 20 years old, the nephew of a man Frederick had done business with at the cattle market, and when Dahlin registered his first meeting with Ramon with the particular careful silence of a man who had not expected a Mexican hand on the Collier ranch and was deciding what he thought about it, Frederick said, without ceremony, "He knows cattle and he works hard, and that is what this ranch requires," and Dahlin absorbed this. And within 3 months, he and Ramon had developed the cheerful, antagonistic friendship of men who respect each other, and show it through constant disagreement about the correct way to string wire. James started school at age 5, in his mother's classroom, which was either ideal or a complicated social arrangement depending on the day and the particular lesson, and whether James had decided to demonstrate that he was not going to receive special treatment from his teacher, even if she was his mother, which he demonstrated with a regularity that Lillian found professionally admirable and personally exhausting in the evenings when she told Frederick about it. He argued with me about the spelling of necessary for 8 minutes, she told him one evening, leaning against the porch railing with her arms crossed and her expression balanced between exasperation and pride. He said the way I was teaching it was arbitrary and that the English language had made poor choices. Frederick considered this. He is not wrong about the English language, he said. Frederick, he is wrong about the timing, he amended. There is a time for critiquing the English language and it is not in the middle of the spelling lesson. Lillian looked at him and then looked away and pressed her lips together firmly. He is exactly like you, she said. He is exactly like you, he said. They looked at each other and both of them were not managing not to smile, and that was the ordinary domestic flavor of their evenings, this particular kind of warmth, specific to them, built from years of specific daily things, the way all real love is built, not from the grand gestures but from the 10,000 small ones accumulated. In the fall of 1886, Lillian was asked to present at a teachers' convention in Austin, having been recommended by the county commissioner, who had initially told her the second teacher was unlikely, a reversal she had accepted without comment but received with considerable private satisfaction. She went to Austin for a week, taking Clara, who was 4, and leaving James with Frederick and the ranch, an arrangement James treated with the solemnity of a small person who has been given significant responsibility and does not intend to fail it. The week she was gone was the longest week Frederick had spent since arriving in Texas 13 years earlier, which was information he considered carefully on its own terms. He wrote to her twice during the week short practical letters about the ranch and James and Second the dog, and she wrote back once, longer, about Austin and the convention, and the things she was learning, and the women she had met who were doing work that mattered in places she had never heard of, and about how Clara had asked in the middle of the convention hall why there were no men teachers at the meeting, and the women around them had laughed, and Lillian had said, because it was true, that some questions are better asked by children. She came home on a Friday evening in October, stepping down from the stage into the Redemption Creek dust with Clara in her arms, and a satchel full of new books, and the particular expression of a woman who has been reminded that the world is large, and has also been reminded that she knows where she belongs in it. Frederick was there to meet her. James was beside him, wearing Frederick's hat, which was enormous on him, and holding Second's lead, which the dog did not require and was tolerating with patient condescension. Lillian saw them from the stage step and her face opened entirely, the full smile, the real one, broad and unguarded and containing everything. She walked to Frederick and he took Clara from her arms and she looked up at him. This woman who had come to his land on a stage from St. Louis 8 years ago with a trunk and a satchel and 6 books, and everything she needed to build something real, and she said, "I am glad to be home," and the word home carried everything it could carry. He kissed her in the middle of the street in Redemption Creek, Texas, in full view of whatever population was available to observe, which was most of it because stage days were social occasions, and it was neither a brief nor ceremonial kiss, and James made the sound that 8-year-old boys make when their parents engage in public affection, and Clara, from Frederick's arms, said, "Again," with the authority of a 4-year-old who has decided she has opinions about everything. And Second sat on Frederick's boot and surveyed the assembled townspeople with regal indifference. Dahlin, watching from the mercantile porch, said to no one in particular, About time for all of that, which was 8 years late and accurate. Life on the ranch in the following years had the quality of things that have found their proper form, not static, not without difficulty, because the West in the 1880s was not a place without difficulty. The droughts and the market fluctuations and the slow formal dissolution of the open range that made men like Frederick renegotiate the terms of what ranching meant. The fencing of the land, the legal battles over water, the changing economics of cattle that required constant adaptation. But difficulty encountered with someone was different from difficulty encountered alone, and Frederick had long since stopped being able to imagine the former. Their third child was born in 1888, another boy, named Henry after Frederick's own father, who had been a difficult man in some ways but a hardworking one, and who had never quite understood his youngest son's need to go so far and make so much of nothing, but who had died proud, Frederick chose to believe. Henry was loud and physical from birth, dramatically unlike his quiet, watchful sister and his thoughtful, combative brother, a child who approached the world by throwing himself at it and seeing what remained standing, which was, Lillian observed, not a quality she recognized from either of his parents, and which she therefore attributed to some recessive wildness that had been waiting for its opportunity. James, by the time Henry was born, was 8 years old and had developed into a precise, curious, occasionally maddening child who read everything available to him, and then asked questions about it that required Frederick and Lillian to confer privately before answering, because some of the questions were the kind that deserved honest answers, and the honest answers were complicated. He asked at age 9 about why Tomás Vega had needed special arrangements to go to the normal school when he was clearly the most intelligent person James had ever met, and Lillian answered that question fully and without softening it, because she believed children deserved honest accounts of the world. And Frederick sat at the kitchen table while she explained and watched his son's face, absorb the information and the particular anger that moved through it, an anger that was recognizably his mother's. Clean and moral, and not going to go anywhere. Tomás himself returned to Redemption Creek in 1887, 20 years old, a qualified teacher, and he took over the Spanish language instruction at the school and eventually the mathematics teaching, which delighted Lillian and satisfied her in the deep way that things satisfy when they prove themselves over time. Alejandro Vega died in 1889, which was a grief, but he died knowing his son had made good, which was not nothing, and was in fact almost everything. The ranch at the turn of the 90s was 900 acres of organized, productive land with 4 hands, and a solid reputation at the San Antonio cattle market, and a modest but growing system of accounts that Lillian still managed with the same reorganizing precision she had brought to it 11 years earlier. The school was 2 rooms now, with 2 teachers, Lillian and Peter Walsh and sometimes Tomás, and 38 children, and a lending library of over 200 books. Redemption Creek had grown as towns do when they find a reason to stay, slowly and without entirely intending to. A blacksmith, a second mercantile, a doctor who had arrived in 1883 and married the daughter of the Holt family and was therefore stuck, another church, this one with an actual preacher, several additional homes on the north edge of town, a post office. On a Sunday evening in October of 1891, Frederick sat on the porch of the ranch house with Lillian beside him in the particular stillness of a good Texas evening, the air cool and clear, the stars coming out over the flat land in their vast, impractical numbers. Henry was asleep inside, having exhausted himself in the south pasture. Clara was reading on the kitchen floor by lamplight with Second lying across her feet. James, 16 now, was somewhere on the north fence line with Dahlin, learning something about wire, which was information James had declared he did not need and would be acquiring anyway. The harvest moon was rising in the east, that same enormous copper moon, the same bruised purple at the edges of the sky, the same amber quality to the air, and Frederick looked at it and thought about October of 1878, The gun pressed to his chest. The woman beside him now who had put it there. The specific thing that had been true before the moon rose. That thing he had known with the certainty of the land and the approaching rain, before she had decided it herself, before she had been given the choice. Before everything that came after, he had known she was staying. He had known it in the way that serious people know things that matter, quietly and completely and with all the weight of his particular character behind it. And she had stayed on her own terms, which was the only way it was ever going to work, and those terms had included honesty and partnership, and the hard, sustained daily work of loving someone you respect, which is different from and more demanding than loving someone you simply need. "What are you thinking about?" Lillian asked beside him on the porch, her voice carrying the ease of a woman who knows she can ask and will receive a real answer. 13 years ago, he said, the first harvest moon. She was quiet for a moment, and he could feel her thinking beside him in the way he had learned to read over all those years, the particular quality of her silence. "You had already decided I was staying," she said, and it was not a question, it was something older and more settled, a thing understood between them for years. "Yes," he said. "That was very presumptuous," she said, but her voice was warm, deeply warm, the warmth of something fully and securely held. "It was," he agreed. "It was also correct." She looked at him and he looked at her in the copper light of the harvest moon over the Texas flatlands, this man and this woman who had built something real from an honest reckoning with each other, and she reached over and took his hand in both of hers, the deliberate way she held important things. "I suppose," she said, "we were both decided before we knew it." "Yes," he said, "I think we were." Inside the house, Henry called out from his room, something incomprehensible but urgent, and Clara called back something equally incomprehensible and definitively dismissive, and Second's tail could be heard thumping against the kitchen floor, and the evening continued in all its specific and ordinary richness around them. This life they had chosen and built and were still building. This land and these people and these children who carried pieces of both of them and would carry them forward into a future that neither could see but both could feel. The way you feel approaching rain, certain and welcome and good. The moon rose fully, white and clear over Redemption Creek, Texas, in October of 1891, and Frederick Collier held his wife's hand on the porch of the ranch he had built from nothing and she had helped make into something. And the stars came out over the flat dark land in their vast and patient numbers. And the story of the thing that had been decided before the harvest moon rose was still going, still adding itself to itself day by ordinary day, still finding its level, still true. James came back from the fence line after dark, carrying 2 broken pieces of wire as evidence of a lesson learned, and found his parents on the porch in the moonlight and rolled his eyes with the specific elaborate suffering of a 16-year-old encountering parental affection, and went inside, and Frederick heard Lillian contain her laugh beside him, contained and then released, genuine and surprised, still the same laugh, still breaking her composure into something open and real, still landing in his chest the same way it had landed the first time he heard it, in the yard, in the October afternoon, 13 years ago. He was, by any measure available to him, a man in possession of exactly the life he was supposed to have, which was not something he had expected at 23 in 100 acres of dry grass, and which he did not take lightly, and which he was glad of every single day. The harvest moon rose full and bright over Redemption Creek, and everything was exactly as it should be.